We're starting chapter 12, which is about sample surveys. So chapter 12 will have 3 videos, and throughout those 3 videos, we're going to talk about 3 main ideas. The first main idea is that we're going to examine a part of the whole. So what that means is that we're going to draw a sample. So if we want to know how the whole population is thinking, we need to know how to go about doing that. So the population is the overall that we're interested in. Am I interested in how my class feels about using M&Ms? Or am I interested in how the whole school feels about uniforms? Or how the state feels about increasing gas prices? Or how the entire country feels about Donald Trump running for president? That can be your population, the overall. The issue is that it is often improbable or impossible to ask everybody individually. If our population is the whole country, there's no way that we're going to be able to talk to every single person in the country. So what we have to do is we have to examine a small group, which is called a sample. And then we can use that sample to decide how the population is thinking. And I know it seems like we shouldn't be able to do that, but statistically it works out. So, for example, if you are making soup, or your mom is making soup, when you make soup, you put all of the ingredients in a pot, and you let it cook until the flavors all come together and taste good. When you decide to taste your soup, to see if it tastes good or if it needs more salt, you don't have to eat the whole pot of soup to figure out if it tastes good. You can stir it around, dip your spoon in, take a bite, and determine, does this taste good? If it does, then you're done cooking. Or maybe we have to add something. But that's what a sample does. You can sample something to determine if it's good or not. So we can sample a population and determine how the whole population feels. So continuing to talk about sample surveys, opinion polls are a good example of taking a sample from the whole population. These polls are examples of sample surveys. Sample surveys are designed to ask questions to a small group of people in hope of learning about the population as a whole. So really what we're going to be doing in chapter 12 is discussing different ways that we can create and collect data for sample surveys. But our main focus today is going to end up to be talking about sampling error and bias, which leads to bias and error. Sampling error, which is also known as sampling variation, describes natural variability in results that you will see from one sample to the next. You expect there to be variation. If I were to measure the average height of my first hour class, it is not going to be exactly the same as the average height of my second hour class. We expect there to be differences. Those differences are called error. I know normally error is supposed to be a bad thing, but in this case, we expect to have it. So error is going to be found in every sample. Bias, on the other hand, is something about the design of the survey that distorts the result so that they are unlikely to reflect reality. Bias is what is actually bad. So polls or surveys often fail because they are using a sampling method that tends to over or underrepresent parts of the population. So for example, they may survey more rich than poor, more white than Latino, more old than young, and that affects your results so that it doesn't actually represent your entire population. Sampling methods that over or under emphasize some characteristics of the population are said to be biased. Bias is the one thing above all else that you want to avoid. If biased in any way, your data is useless and nothing out of it can be used or salvaged. So if you have bias, you have to throw away your entire study and start over. So again, you want to avoid bias. So how do we ensure that our surveys are not biased? Well, I've heard from many of you, Bryant, you asked this on Friday, what is the point of random numbers? When you use random numbers and you randomize, we end up avoiding bias. To avoid bias, we have to randomize our sample. Let's go ahead and talk about the different types of bias. The first type is undercoverage. This gives part of the population less representation than it has in the actual population. For example, at a high school, there are freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. If somebody wanted to know about how students felt about having an open campus for lunch, and they only asked the underclassmen, freshmen and sophomores, you're probably going to get a different response because the upperclassmen are undercovered, and the upperclassmen are probably the ones who would leave because they're the ones who can drive. So that's one type of bias. Another type is non-response. Non-response is when people can't be contacted or they refuse to answer. What happens in this situation is that those who do respond are likely not to represent the entire population. Typically in this case, you get people with strong feelings. They either really like something or they really don't like something. And typically it's more of the negative. For the most part, if people are happy, they tend to stay quiet. But if people are really upset about something, they tend to be more vocal. The other kind of non-response is a voluntary response. This is when the sample is self-selected. So you're listening into the radio and the radio DJ asks people to call in to give their opinion on something. That's voluntary response. You have to call and actually respond. Again, this is another situation where strong opinions are more likely to want to participate. Another type of bias is response bias. Anything in a survey design that influences responses is a type of response bias. Typically, you get incorrect answers by respondents for it to be a response bias. And this kind of can go basically with the design of the survey. For example, let's say that you're trying to determine how many students at Hackett cheat. And you were to walk up to them and you were to ask them, did you cheat on your last math test? They're most likely to say no to you. If it were an anonymous survey where they can write in their answer and they don't have a name to it, you're probably more likely to get an honest response that way. So that's a design flaw that leads to response bias. The other type of response bias is called wording bias. And that's the way that the question was worded can influence the results. In this situation, typically the question is phrased to guide you to an opinion. For example, if I were to ask people, how do you feel about building a new prison with how the crime rate has increased? Well, you're hearing crime rate has increased, so yes, we need a new prison. It's guiding you to an answer that maybe I specifically want you to give. So that's a type of response bias as well. And then there's selection bias. Selection bias is if a sample is chosen simply because it was easy to obtain. We call this a convenience sample. It consists of individuals who are conveniently available. This often fails to be representative. Again, if I were in the middle of our class and I were to ask you guys how you feel about having an open campus for lunch, I am only talking to seniors, and specifically only 9 seniors that are in AP Stats. So that was just convenient for me, and it's not going to be representative of the entire school. How do we think about biases? You want to look for bias in any survey you encounter before you collect the data. There's no way to recover from bias once the sample has been done. If there is bias in your sample, you have to start over from scratch. You can't just throw out the responses that were biased. You have to start all over. So that's why we kind of want to make sure that when you are designing the survey, you are thinking about bias before you actually go about collecting your data. When you are discussing or identify bias, though, you must explain how the bias affects the response estimate. You need to explain, does it over or underestimate? Does it mean people are going to respond in a specific way? Why is it biased? We have to talk about that. Also, if you can't remember what specific type of bias it is, at least describe it and explain how it will affect your estimate. You also want to make sure that you spend your time and resources reducing bias, because once again, bias is bad. If you possibly can, pilot test your survey first, because that will be really helpful. Finally, always report your sampling methods in detail. Explain what you did, how you did it, how people were selected, how people were assigned. You want to make sure that everything is explained, so that way, if there is bias, you're more likely to see it, so that way you can fix it before you start. Other than that, that is it for today, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a great night.